Morale boost, perhaps, with the latest inflation reading unexpectedly cooling, strengthening the case for the Bank of England to cut interest rates once again in the month of May. But it's been a very challenging time for the Chancellor, and she's expected to slash government spending to put the public finances back on track and downgrade growth forecasts made less than 6 months ago. Let's have a quick check on where we are on some UK assets as we work our way towards this spring statement then. The pound currently trading at around the 128 level, 128.89, down 0.4%, and continues to lose a little bit of ground as we saw 7 o'clock this morning, that inflation print that came in softer than expected. Yes, services was sticky, but broadly headline softer than expected, and the market has responded to that. The FTSE 100 up 0.2%, and you can see the gilt market represented on there, and I can tell you that across the UK gilt curve we see those yields a little bit weaker. We see a bit of gilt buying across the curve. To the gilt market we'll go, though, with the 30-year yield in mind, because it doesn't matter where you pick really, but particularly at the longer end, we have seen such a climb in yields since the last big fiscal event. And this is a fiscal event that the Chancellor didn't really want to be a big deal. She wanted it to all be about the budget back in October, November, back in the autumn time of last year. Since then, though, we have, partly due to domestic factors and partly perhaps due to international factors, we've seen a big drive higher in yields, and that'll be something that is shaping the government's thinking as we head into this spring statement. Now, Bloomberg's Lizzie Burden is outside Parliament, and she brings us a brief update on what we can expect. Lizzie, good morning once again, or good afternoon it is now. What's at stake then for the Chancellor today?
Well, Anna, the Chancellor's political life may not be at stake today, but I would certainly say her credibility is. You point to those sluggish growth numbers, the rise in government borrowing costs. It looks like today her headroom that she left in October will have been wiped out. We wait for the Office for Budget Responsibility's forecast, but our economists say she's going to have to find £17 billion today. Now, where's it going to come from? She's already announced welfare cuts that we were told were worth £5 billion. We'll see if the OBR agrees with that. We've already seen her cutting aid to fund defence. Now, that actually gives her some headroom, £2.4 billion of it, because of a bit of fiscal wizardry. It counts as investment. So it leaves her having to find £10 billion, which we expect to be squeezed out of departmental budgets, and we'll find out which when it comes to the spending review in June. But look, even if she leaves herself with more headroom today, it could be wiped out by October. And even with all of this, it's already politically toxic. There are many in not just her party, but the cabinet as well, saying welfare cuts on top of aid cuts, on top of cutting the pensioners' winter fuel allowance is not what a Labour Chancellor should be doing. But Anna, I've spoken to the Chancellor many times before and since she got into power, and I can tell you this is someone who is scarred by the experience of watching Liz Truss's demise, so she does not want to be messing with the bond vigilantes today.
Lizzie, thank you very much. Bloomberg's Lizzie Burden live in Westminster for us. I should tell you, just across the road from where Lizzie is there, we are witnessing Prime Minister's questions, of course, taking place in the House of Commons. We'll continue to monitor that, and that is where we will hear the Chancellor speak in just, 12 minutes from now. Joining us to preview the Chancellor's speech then is the Head of Economics, Bloomberg's Head of Economics and Government, Stephanie Flanders, and John Stepek from Bloomberg Wealth, who writes our daily newsletter, Money Distilled. Welcome to both of you. So the big event is the spring statement, of course, but as soon as she sits down, we get more detail. We get the DMO numbers, so just how much is the government going to be borrowing and when. We also get the OBR's assessment from the Chancellor, perhaps. There's a lot going into this, not just what the Chancellor tells us. What are you going to be watching for, John?
Well, I think the DMO is going to be interesting in terms of how much gilt issuance they think there's going to be this year. So that's expected to be around about between 300 and 310 billion. So any number kind of over that is something that I'd be, a bit nervous about. But you wouldn't expect that to happen. It's already been well managed. And as far as the OBR goes, obviously be looking for, if they change their forecasts. But again, I don't know, obviously with you, Stephanie, but I'd be really surprised if they make any major shifts, probably downgrade the expected GDP growth, because that's clearly too optimistic at the moment. But I think they would probably save any kind of bigger revisions for closer to kind of the autumn budget. because that's a bigger deal.
Yes, it is a bigger deal. This was supposed to not be a big deal, wasn't it, Stephanie? It's turned out to be a bit of a big deal, I suppose, for this Chancellor.
So what have we learned in the last 10 years? Every Chancellor comes in saying they only want to have one fiscal event or they only want to have one budget, and it's always a mistake because you always end up needing to change things. We have lived in pretty changeable times. I think what's really striking, I mean, Lizzie mentioned, there's obviously a lot of backbenchers who are nervous and uncomfortable with cutting the welfare budget, even though it has soared in recent years and is clearly a massive hole in the budget. But I think what makes other people uncomfortable is just how many decisions are now fundamentally based on the Office for Budget Responsibility. This this unelected, pretty accountable, but still independent, non-government Office for Budget Responsibility, not only on the kind of longer-term economic forecast, which could make a huge difference, we might see that down the road, but also just, on whether or not benefit claimants will actually respond in a certain way to a change in the system. That seems to be, that's getting into territory that we wouldn't necessarily have expected the OBR to get into, and has caused quite a lot of last-minute scrabbling around for a few billion as they've reassessed the government's own numbers on those welfare cuts last week.
Yes. Is the granular detail that the OBR is having to get into, and as you say, we didn't have the OBR that many, you don't have to go that many years back to find a time we didn't have it.
15 years.
There we go.
Yeah.
So the fact they have to get into that granular, that really granular detail, is that an illustration of just how tight the headroom is? That's why we're all so sort of obsessed with that.
You could make the argument, you could definitely make the argument that like previous recent chancellors, Rachel Reeves had only left herself with 10 billion headroom. One thing we're looking for, which we expect to happen, is that she will want to retain that, even though probably the numbers have gone awry by about 17 billion. We think she's going to be looking... The borrowing has gone up, relatively speaking, by 17 billion just since that budget. She could, of course, just choose to be meeting exactly her fiscal rule by finding 7 billion, but we don't think she's going to do that. I think, though, if you look at the decisions that the OBR is going to be making, they're going to be deciding not just whether those benefit cuts are real, which they've already done, but whether the short-term slowdown in the economy, the unexpected slowdown, is permanent. We think they might think some of it's going to be lasting. That will have an impact, as already maybe added 10 billion to the numbers. But then there's much bigger, and John's kind of hinting at it, the much bigger decision, whether the bad news we've had for the years about productivity is actually something that's going to go into the future. And that's potentially a sort of 50 billion type number in terms of the impact on borrowing. And I think we might get, who knows, but I think there's a possibility they will signal that it's really long overdue to assess that in the budget. But I think it'd be very surprising if they did that now.
As sort of facing up to the productivity reality for the UK economy. How much is the international context hanging over all of this then, John? Because I'm sure, well, we've seen chancellors in the past at least trying to blame the international context, and maybe that's right. We've seen President Trump, and many people have suggested that some of his policies could be inflationary. We've seen yields climb higher in the States. Over in Germany, what could be a growth gift in the future has delivered higher rates in the short term. All of that international context is relevant, I suppose, but there are homegrown factors too. Yeah,
I mean, I think the international context really matters, and I think it's fair for the Chancellor to put some blame on that, and certainly a lot of the uncertainty in the near future is going to be down to things like tariffs and just the general increase in uncertainty. At the same time, I think it is reasonable to criticise the tone that the government took when it came into power. I think that was a big surprise to people. I also think that the choice of raising tax via increasing the tax on employers' national insurance contributions was probably a kind of counterproductive way to raise that tax. I understand why she did it. I understand you can make the argument either way, but clearly it's had an impact on employers' plans for hiring. And that's not something... It's not exactly a kind of pro-growth tax rise.
Yes.
So I do think that there's that element. But to be honest, the main problem is, essentially, Stephanie's already said, that she didn't leave herself with any headroom, really. And she also committed very aggressively to meeting these fiscal rules. And to an extent, they are somewhat arbitrary. And again, Stephanie's point about the OBR suddenly becoming this thing that you cannot, go against, even though it has only been around for 15 years. It was introduced as a pure piece of cynical political theatre by George Osborne to make sure that a future Labour government would face this problem. And the problem is that because of what happened with Liz Truss, Labour then did exactly the same thing as Osborne had done, and now it's coming back to bite them in the backside. My own view is that the OBR is a quango that should be scrapped, and that accountability should remain with our elected representatives. And it has gone a wee bit too far in terms of saying, well, actually, no, this benefit cut is going to, we're shaving $1 billion off that.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a good article, I think it was in the Telegraph the other day, where one of the Conservative guys was saying something very similar. They presented all this data about how the growth plans would definitely work to the OBR, and the OBR was just saying that these ideas you've got for improving growth, we're not going to pay any attention to them whatsoever. So I think it's got too much power over policy now, and I think that a reform is long overdue.
There we go. Stephanie,
Tell us what you really feel. I think that's a deeply uncharitable view of George Osborne's creation of the ABR. I mean, the argument for it was that we'd had, economists inside the Treasury, outside the Treasury, get their numbers wildly wrong all the time. And to be wildly wrong because they're economists doing their job, getting things wrong, seemed like a better reason than also being wrong because you're kind of politically fixing the numbers. So I think there was I would push back. There's many things you might accuse George Osborne of.
Politically neutral than wrong and politically biased.
But I mean, I think there is this irony kind of buried in what we're saying, which is a government it feels like the more long-term the government strategy, this government has really put a lot on a challenging approach to growth that actually tries to tackle long-term things like planning, things that we know are not going to make a difference overnight. And the OBR knows it's not going to make a difference overnight. So the main thing that she's trying to do is something that the OBR probably won't give them credit for quite a long time, even if she's successful. So a very long-termist, quote-unquote, government ends up being subject to these very short-term, more than usually subject to these very short-term billions here and there judgments by the OBR.
Yes. Can I ask you about multipliers then, and what gets us to growth in the UK? Because this has become a big topic of conversation around this desk early in the morning when we're talking to people about Germany and defence spending and whether that drops down to growth. And in the UK, we've heard the government make arguments. We invest in defence because we need to, but also they added bonuses that we might get some growth out of it as well. House building, for example, is supposed to be something that I was told this week has quite a high multiplier and will boost the UK economy. If we're looking for growth, where do we look today in the spring statement? Is there anything that they can do when they're all focused on welfare cuts? Is there anything they can do that really boosts the growth side?
I mean, I think they will certainly be pointing to some of the defence stuff. I think the numbers, one is a bit sceptical about even if they're going to be able to crank up the numbers as much as they want in the next year, because it is hard to increase this investment short term. But that will have, I mean, defence spending can be quite labour intensive, quite productive of growth. If they are able to make headway on some of these unlocking some of these big infrastructure projects, I think we've finally seen the OK for the lower Thames crossing. It's only taken, a million years. But if that is able to move forward, I think, there are things that can give a boost to the construction industry if you're able to also ramp up the number of builders and people with the right skills, which we know has been a real issue, particularly since Brexit.
Yes, and just the same conversation happening in other parts of Europe as well, and Germany in particular, as they try to ramp up infrastructure spend and all sorts. Is this going to be dubbed austerity, John? Is that the conversation we're going to have to get into, the definition of that, and whether that is, or we leave that to the politicians, perhaps? No,
I mean, it probably will be dubbed austerity. I don't think that is reasonable. I think the word austerity gets thrown about an awful lot. I mean, remember, we are literally talking about a reduction in the real terms rate of increase in spending on welfare here. We're not actually talking about anything that... I mean, a normal human being watching this would think, well, does that mean we're actually going to spend less cash? And of course, that's absolutely not what we're doing. We're not even necessarily cutting it in real terms. And, again, as Stephanie pointed out, the welfare budget has exploded since COVID, and there have got to be structural reasons for that we can try and do something about. Which the problem is, if we have this ever increasing, if it's always going to go up in real terms, then the rest of the economy is going to get squeezed out.
Yeah, I mean, I do think one thing that we're missing in this, which you hinted at, Anna, is there has been a big change in the global environment in the borrowing costs for any government, and that's come even at a time when the Federal Reserve was cutting interest rates. We've seen a sort of 1 percentage point whatever increase in long rates, and that fundamentally changes her job, Rachel Reeves' job, in a way that even George Osborne didn't face, because he had his bill was almost going down even as the debt was soaring because of what was happening to long-term interest rates. If that, it feels like that is a permanent shift, and all of our economist research suggests that's a permanent shift in the horizon, which means, you know, she's spending more on debt interest than the education budget. It's now 8% of spending that was just barely there a few years ago.
Yes, I mean, and that's why she has to stick to the fiscal rules then, is it? Because that's what the debt market's going to be nervous of, whether the long-term trajectory around debt is sustainable. And
I think on the austerity point, I do think, I get the sense, and probably the Treasury team will correct me on this when I come off, but I think she's been talking about austerity as when you're shrinking, when spending's growing more slowly than the economy. And she would be pointing to all these departments saying, partly because the economy is not growing very much, so spending's not growing very much. But she appears to have a definition that is, well, it's not austerity if we're actually not shrinking it as a share of GDP.
Yes, I'm sure we'll be back to arguing about that, won't we, about the definition of austerity. That's no doubt where these things will go. John was making that point about the tone of the budget and the sort of legacy of that. We had the tone around it and we had the national insurance increase. Stephanie, are we still in that sort of sluggish period post the budget then, where we still it's not even April, is it, where the business world gets used to higher minimum wages and that increase in employers' national insurance?
I mean, we are seeing sort of underlying strength in the labour market. So far, we're not actually seeing signs, certainly on the hiring front, that kind of quite significant increase in costs of labour are affecting that part of the market. But, you know, the sort of rhetoric, the mood shift that was associated, rightly or wrongly, with the budget, I think, is a sort of lingering issue for the government, that they messed up, I think, that bit of messaging around the budget, that it was just not enough. There wasn't enough focus on the positive side, the infrastructure, the planning, all that stuff that was happening as they were having to unveil this bad news. And I think, even with what's going on in the international arena, that whether you can shift away from that, I don't know.
Yes, and with that said, with that reminder of what's happened since the budget, interesting to see that Keir Starmer was asked at Prime Minister's questions about his backing for Rachel Reeves, and Starmer reaffirms he has full confidence in Reeves, but just shows you where the conversation's got to, that he's being asked, I suppose, about that. This morning, John, we saw that inflation number out from the UK, and that's something the markets have been digesting already, so inflation coming in weaker than expected, but services looking kind of sluggish. Looking kind of sticky, and that's not going to be great news for the Bank of England.
I mean, it's not ideal. I think, though, the Bank of England, certainly the tone the Bank of England's taken, is that it's willing to kind of look through inflation. And I think it's worth bearing in mind, I mean, inflation, as measured by CPI, is going to be bordering on 3% odds for most of the rest of this year. And so that's going to make it politically a little bit tricky for the Bank of England, but I think the steady decline will continue, and I think that's really important given our debt costs are such a significant part of the budget now.
Your thoughts on the inflation picture then, Stephanie? Still waiting for Rachel Reeves to
there was some, as you mentioned, there was a sort of, you know, just the latest numbers going down to 2.8, I think probably does mean pave the way for a Bank of England cut. And she's proud that there have been some cuts since they came in.
There have been. OK, let's tune in now to the Chancellor with her spring statement.
To provide security for working people and to deliver a decade of national renewal. That work began in July, and I am proud of what we have delivered in just 9 months. Restoring stability to our public finances, giving the Bank of England the foundation to cut interest rates 3 times since the general election, rebuilding our public services, with record investment in our NHS, bringing waiting lists down for 5 months in a row. And increasing the national living wage to give 3 million people a pay rise from next week. Now our task is to secure Britain's future in a world that is changing before our eyes. The threat facing our continent was transformed when Putin invaded Ukraine. It has since escalated further and will continue to evolve rapidly. At the same time, the global economy has become more uncertain, bringing insecurity at home as trading patterns become more unstable and borrowing costs rise for many major economies. Mr. Speaker, the job of a responsible government is not simply to watch this change. This moment demands an active government, a government not stepping back, but stepping up. A government on the side of working people, helping Britain to reach its potential. And, Mr. Speaker, we have the strength to do just that. As one of the world's largest economies, an ally to trading partners across the globe, and a hub for global innovation. These strengths and the progress that we have made so far mean that we can act quickly and decisively in a more uncertain world to secure Britain's future and to deliver prosperity for working people. Mr. Speaker, as I set out at the budget last year, I am today returning to the House to provide an update on our public finances, supported by a new forecast from the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility. Ahead of a full spending review in June, I will then return to the House in the autumn to deliver a budget in line with our commitment to deliver just one major fiscal event a year. So let me now turn to the OBR's forecasts. And I want to thank Richard Hughes and his team for their dedicated work. The increased global uncertainty has had two consequences. First, on our public finances, and second, on our economy. I will take each in turn. In the autumn, I set out our new fiscal rules that would guide this government. These fiscal rules are non-negotiable. They are the embodiment of this government's unwavering commitment to bring stability to our economy and to ensure security for working people. Because the British people have seen what happens when a government borrows beyond their means. The mini-budget delivered by the party opposite resulted in higher bills, in higher rents and higher mortgages. And, Mr. Speaker, it was not the wealthy who suffered most when they crushed the economy. It was ordinary working people. And they continue to feel the effects 2.5 years later of the damage that the party opposite did. Now, let me be clear. There is nothing progressive, there is nothing Labour about working people paying the price for economic irresponsibility. British people put their trust in this Labour government because they knew that I would never take risks with the public finances, that we would never do anything to put household finances in danger, and we must earn that trust every single day. The two rules that I set out at the budget were first, our stability rule, which ensures that public spending is under control, balancing the current budget by 2029-30, so that day-to-day spending is met by tax receipts. Second, our investment rule, to drive growth in the economy, ensuring that net financial debt falls by the end of the forecast period, while enabling us to invest alongside business. Turning first to the stability rule, the OBR's forecast shows that before the steps that I will take in this statement, the current budget would have been in deficit by £4.1 billion in 2029-30, having been in surplus by £9.9 billion in the autumn, as the UK, alongside our international peers like France and Germany, has seen the cost of borrowing rise during this period of heightened uncertainty in global markets. As a result of the steps that I am taking today, I can confirm that I have restored in full our headroom against the stability rule, moving from a deficit of £36.1 billion in 2025-26 and £13.4 billion in 2026-27 to a surplus of £6.0 billion in 27-28, £7.1 billion in 2028-29, and a surplus of £9.9 billion in 2029-30. That compares to the headroom left by the previous government of just £6.5 billion. That means we are continuing to meet the stability rule 2 years early, building resilience to shocks in this, a more uncertain world. The OBR forecast that the investment rule is also met 2 years early, with net financial debt of 82.9% of GDP in 25-26 and 83.5% in 26-27, before falling to 83.4% in 27-28, in 83.2% in 2028-29, and then to 82.7% in 2029-30, providing headroom of £15.1 billion in the final year of the forecast, broadly unchanged from the autumn. After the last government doubled the national debt, after they doubled the national debt interest payments now stand at £105.2 billion this year. Mr. Speaker, that is more than we allocate to defence, the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice combined. That is the legacy of the party opposite. So the responsible choice is to reduce our levels of debt and borrowing in the years ahead so that we can spend more on the priorities of working people, and that is exactly what this government will do. Mr. Speaker, I said that our fiscal rules were non-negotiable, and I meant it. I will always deliver economic stability, and I will always put working people first. I said it at the election, I said it at the budget, and I say it again today. Let me now set out the steps that the government has taken. At the budget, we protected working people by keeping our promise not to raise their rates of national insurance, income tax or VAT. At the same time, we began to rebuild our public services after the party opposite left a £22 billion black hole in our public finances. Ours were the right choices for stability and the right choices for renewal, funded by the decisions that we took on tax. As I promised in the autumn, this statement does not contain any further tax increases. But when working people are paying their taxes while still struggling with the cost of living, it cannot be right that others are still evading what they rightly owe in tax. In the budget, I delivered the most ambitious package of measures that we have ever seen to cut down on tax evasion, raising £6.5 billion per year by the end of the forecast. Today, I go further, continuing our investment in cutting-edge technology, investing in the HMRC's capacity to crack down on tax avoidance, and setting out plans to increase the number of tax fraudsters charged every year by 20%. These changes raise a further £1 billion, taking the total revenue raised from reducing tax evasion under this Labour government to £7.5 billion. These figures are verified by the Office for Budget Responsibility, and I want to thank my honourable friend, the Exchequer Secretary, for his continued work in this area. Mr. Speaker, last week, my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, set out this government's plans to reform the welfare system. The Labour Party is the party of work. We believe that if you can work, you should work. But if you can't work, you should be properly supported. This government inherited a broken system. More than 1,000 people every day are qualifying for personal independence payments. 1 in 8 young people are not in employment, education or training. If we do nothing, we are writing off an entire generation. That cannot be right, and we will not stand for it. It is a waste of their potential, and it is a waste of their futures, and we will change it. As my right honourable friend said in her statement last week, the final costings would be subject to the OBR's assessment. Today, the OBR have said that they estimate that the package will save £4.8 billion in the welfare budget, reflecting their judgments on behavioural effects and wider factors. This also reflects final adjustments to the overall package, consistent with the Secretary of State's statement last week and the government's Pathways to Work Green Paper. The Universal Credit Standard Allowance will increase from £92 per week in 25-26 to £106 a week by 29-30, while the Universal Credit Health element will be cut for new claimants by around 50% and then frozen. On top of this, we are investing £1 billion to provide guaranteed, personalised employment support to help people back into work. And £400 million to support the Department for Work and Pensions and our job centres to deliver these changes effectively and fairly, taking total savings after that to the package to £3.4 billion. While spending on disability and sickness benefits will continue to rise, these plans mean that welfare spending as a share of GDP will fall between 2026 and the end of the forecast period, very different to what we inherited from the party opposite. We are reforming our welfare system, making it more sustainable, protecting the most vulnerable, and most importantly, supporting more people back into secure work, lifting them out of poverty. Mr. Speaker, at the budget, I fixed the foundations of our economy to deliver on the promise of change. That work has already begun. 2 million extra appointments in our NHS. Waiting lists down. New breakfast clubs opening across England. The largest settlements in real terms for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland in the history of devolution. Asylum costs falling, promises made, promises kept, and every single one of them opposed by the parties opposite. At the budget, alongside providing an increase in funding for this year and next, I set the envelope for the spending review, which we will deliver in June, led by my right honourable friend, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, to set departmental budgets until 28-29 for day-to-day spending and until 2029-30 for capital spending. Today, I'm reflecting two steps that we have taken on our spending plans. First, because we are living in an uncertain world, as the Prime Minister has set out, we will increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP, reducing overseas aid to 0.3% of gross national income. This means we save £2.6 billion in day-to-day spending in 2029-30 to fund our more capital-intensive defence commitments. Second, in recent months, we have begun to fundamentally reform the British state, driving efficiency and productivity across government, to deliver tangible savings and improve services across our country. Earlier the Prime Minister set out plans to abolish the arm's-length body NHS England and ensure that that money goes directly to improving the service for patients. My right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, is driving forward vital reforms to increase NHS productivity, bearing down on costly agency spend to save money so that we can improve patient care. And my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, is taking forward work to significantly reduce the costs of running government by 15%, worth £2 billion by the end of the decade. This work shows that we can make our state leaner and more agile, delivering more resources to the front line, while ensuring that we control day-to-day spending to meet our fiscal rules. Today, I build on that work by bringing forward £3.25 billion of investment to deliver the reforms that our public services need through a new transformation fund. That is money brought forward now to bring down the costs of running government by the end of the forecast period, by making public services more efficient, more productive and more focused on the user. I can confirm today the first allocations from this fund, including funding for voluntary exit schemes to reduce the size of the civil service, pioneering AI tools to modernise the state, investment in technology for the Ministry of Justice to deliver probation services more effectively, and upfront investment so we can support more children into foster care to give them the best possible start in life and reduce cost pressures in the future. Our work to make government leaner, more productive and more efficient will help deliver a further £3.5 billion of day-to-day savings by 2029-30. Overall, day-to-day spending will be reduced by £6.1 billion in 2029-30, and it will now grow by an average of 1.2% a year above inflation, compared to 1.3% in the autumn. Mr. Speaker, I can confirm to the House that day-to-day spending will increase in real terms above inflation in every single year of the forecast. And in the spending review, apart from the reductions in overseas aid, day-to-day spending across government has been fully protected. I can also confirm our approach to capital investment. In the autumn budget, I announced £100 billion of additional capital spending to crowd in investment from the private sector, to fix our crumbling infrastructure, and to create jobs in every corner of our country. Today, I am not cutting capital spending, as the party opposite did time and time again, because that choked off growth and it left our school roofs literally crumbling. That was the wrong choice. It was the irresponsible choice. It was the Tory choice. Today, I am instead increasing capital spending by an average of £2 billion per year compared with the autumn, to drive growth in our economy and to deliver in full our vital commitments on defence. This government will ensure that every pound we spend will deliver for the British people by increasing productivity, driving growth in our economy and improving our frontline public services. Mr. Speaker, let me turn now to the impact of increased uncertainty on our economy. To deliver economic stability, we must work closely with the Bank of England, supporting the Independent Monetary Policy Committee to meet their 2% inflation target. There have been 3 interest rate cuts since the general election, and today's data showed that inflation fell in February. Having peaked at 11% under the previous government, the OBR forecast that CPI inflation will average 3.2% this year before falling rapidly to 2.1% in 2026 and meeting the 2% target from 2027 onwards, giving families and businesses the security that they need and providing our economy with the stable platform it needs to grow. Mr. Speaker, earlier this month, the OECD downgraded this year's growth forecast for every G7 economy, including the UK. And the OBR have today revised down our growth forecast for 2025, from 2% in the autumn to 1% today. I am not satisfied with these numbers, and that is why we on this side of the House are serious about taking the action needed to grow our economy. Backing the builders, not the blockers, with a 3rd runway at Heathrow Airport and the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. Increasing investment with reforms to our pension system and a new national wealth fund. And tearing down regulatory barriers in every sector of our economy. That is a serious plan for growth. That is a serious plan to improve living standards. That is a serious plan to renew our country. Mr. Speaker, a changing world presents challenges, but it also presents new opportunities for new jobs and new contracts in our world-class defence industrial centres, from Belfast to Deeside and from Plymouth to Rosyth. In February, the Prime Minister set out our government's commitment to increase spending on defence to 2.5% of GDP from April 2027, the biggest sustained increase in defence spending since the end of the Cold War, with an ambition to spend 3% of GDP on defence in the next Parliament. That was the right decision in a more insecure world, putting an extra £6.4 billion into defence spending by 2027. But we have to move quickly in this changing world, and that starts with investment. So today I can confirm that I will provide an additional £2.2 billion for the Ministry of Defence in the next financial year, a further down payment on our plans to deliver 2.5% of GDP by 2027. This additional investment is not just about increasing our national security, but increasing our economic security too. As defence spending rises, I want the whole country to feel its benefits. So I will now set out the immediate steps that we are taking to boost Britain's defence industry and to make the UK a defence industrial superpower. We will spend a minimum of 10% of the Ministry of Defence's equipment budget on new novel technologies, including drones and AI-enabled technology. Driving forward advanced manufacturing production in places like Glasgow, in Derby and in Newport. Creating demand for highly skilled engineers and scientists, and delivering new business opportunities for UK tech firms and startups. We will establish a protected budget of £400 million within the Ministry of Defence, a budget that will rise over time for UK defence innovation, with a clear mandate to bring innovative technology to the front line at speed. And we will reform our broken defence procurement system, making it quicker, more agile and more streamlined, and giving small businesses across the UK better access to Ministry of Defence contracts, something welcomed by the Federation of Small Businesses. We will take forward our plan for Barrow, a town at the heart of our nuclear security, working with my honourable friend, the member for Barrow and Furness, and providing £200 million, supporting the creation of thousands of jobs there. We will regenerate Portsmouth Naval Base, securing its future, as called for by my honourable friend, the member for Portsmouth South. We will secure better homes for thousands of military families, the homes that they deserve, denied to them by the previous government. Homes for our military families in constituencies of my honourable friends for Plymouth Moorview, Plymouth Sutton and Devonport, York Outer and in Aldershot. That is the difference that this Labour government is making. Finally, Mr. Speaker, we will provide £2 billion of increased capacity for UK export finance to provide loans for overseas buyers of UK defence goods and services, because I want to do more with our defence budget so we can buy and make and sell things here in Britain. Giving further opportunities for our world-leading defence companies and those who work in them to grow and create jobs here in Britain as military spending rightly increases all across Europe. To oversee all of this vital work, my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, and I will establish a new Defence Growth Board to maximise the benefits from every pound of taxpayers' money that we spend. And we will put defence at the heart of our modern industrial strategy to drive innovation that can deliver huge benefits back into the British economy. Mr. Speaker, that is how we make our country a defence industrial superpower. So the skills of the future, the jobs of the future and the opportunities of the future can be found right here in the United Kingdom. Mr. Speaker, as the previous government learned to their detriment, there are no shortcuts to economic growth. It will take long-term decisions. It will take hard yards. It will take time for the reforms that we are introducing to be felt in the everyday economy. It is right that the Office for Budget Responsibility consider the evidence and look carefully at measures before recognising a growth impact in their forecast. But, Mr. Speaker, I can announce to the House that the OBR have considered and have scored one of the central planks of our plan for growth. In my first week as Chancellor, I announced that we were pursuing the most ambitious set of planning reforms in decades to get Britain building again. And in December, we published changes to the National Planning Policy Framework, driven forward tirelessly by my right honourable friend, the Deputy Prime Minister. Reintroducing mandatory housing targets and bringing grey belt land into scope. The OBR have today concluded that these reforms will permanently increase the level of real GDP by 0.2% in 29-30, an additional £6.8 billion for our economy, and by 0.4% of GDP within 10 years, an additional £15.1 billion in our British economy. Mr. Speaker, that is the biggest positive growth impact that the OBR have ever reflected in their forecast for a policy with no fiscal cost. And taken together with our plans to increase capital spending that we set out in the budget last year, this government's policies will increase the level of real GDP by 0.6% in the next 10 years. Mr. Speaker, that is the difference that this Labour government is making. policies to grow our economy. Promises by a Labour government, delivered by a Labour government, opposed by the parties opposite. Mr. Speaker, the planning system that we inherited was far too slow. The OBR have concluded that our reforms will lead to house building reaching a 40-year high. 305,000 homes a year by the end of the forecast period. And changes to the National Planning Policy Framework alone will help build over 1.3 million homes in the UK over the next 5 years, taking us within touching distance of delivering our manifesto promise to build 1.5 million homes in England in this Parliament. Homes promised by this Labour government, homes built by this Labour government, homes opposed by the parties opposite. The impact on our economy goes further still. I said at the election that we could not simply tax and spend our way to prosperity. We need economic growth. So I can today confirm that the effect of our growth policies, including our planning reforms, means an additional £3.4 billion to support our public finances and our public services by 2029-30. The proceeds of growth, promised by this Labour government, delivered by this Labour government, opposed by the parties opposite. Mr. Speaker, earlier this week, we provided an additional £2 billion of investment in social and affordable homes next year, delivering up to 18,000 new homes and allowing local areas to bid for new development across our country, including sites in Thanet, in Sunderland and in Swindon. More security for families across our country, promised by this Labour government, delivered by this Labour government and opposed by the parties opposite. And to build these new homes, we need people with the right skills. Earlier this week, my right honourable friend, the Education Secretary, announced more than £600 million to train up 60,000 more construction workers, including with 10 new technical excellence colleges across every region of our country, giving working people the chance to fulfil their potential. New opportunities for our young people, promised by this Labour government, delivered by this Labour government, opposed by the parties opposite. Mr. Speaker, all this is just the start. The Planning and Infrastructure Bill passed its second reading on Monday. No thanks to the parties opposite. Once this bill completes its passage, it will help deliver the homes and infrastructure our country badly needs. And I say to the parties opposite, the British people will be watching. Because if the parties opposite don't support these reforms, let us be clear about what that means. They are opposing economic growth. They are opposing more homes for families. They are opposing good jobs across our country. We on this side are clear about whose side we are on. The parties opposite must decide too. This Labour government is taking the right decisions now to secure Britain's future. And today I can confirm to the House that the OBR have upgraded their growth forecast next year and every single year thereafter. With GDP growth of 1.9% in 2026, of 1.8% in 2027, 1.7% in 2028 and 1.8% in 2029. Mr. Speaker, by the end of the forecast, our economy is larger compared to the OBR's forecast at the time of the budget. That is the difference that this Labour government is making. But, Mr. Speaker, this isn't just about lines on a graph. It's about improving people's lives. Working people are still feeling the pinch after a cost of living crisis caused by the party opposite that caused interest rates and inflation to go through the roof. So I am pleased that the OBR confirmed today that real household disposable income will now grow this year at almost twice the rate expected in the autumn. Compared to the forecast in the final budget delivered by the party opposite, and after taking into account inflation, the OBR say today that people will be, on average, over £500 a year better off under this Labour government. That will mean more money in the pockets of working people, higher living standards promised by this Labour government, delivered by this Labour government, opposed by the parties opposite. Mr. Speaker, the world is changing. We can see that and we can feel it. A changing world demands a government that is on the side of working people, acting in their interest, acting in the national interest, not retreating from challenges, not stepping back, but a government with the courage to step up, to secure Britain's future and to seize the opportunities that are out there before us. I am impatient for change. The British people are impatient for change after 14 years of failure. And we are beginning to see change happen. Our plan for change is working. Defence spending is rising. Waiting lists are falling. Wages are up. Interest rates are cut. That is the difference that this Labour government is making. And today, Mr. Speaker, the OBR confirm that our plan to get Britain building will drive growth in our economy and put more money in people's pockets. There are no quick fixes, but we have taken the right choices, returning stability to our economy after years of mismanagement by the party opposite, delivering security for our country and security for working people. That is what drives this government. That is what drives me as Chancellor. That is what drives the choices that I have set out today, and I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Chancellor Mel Stride.
Mr. Speaker, at the last budget...
There we are, the Chancellor of the Exchequer delivering her spring statements, and we are just looking at pictures now of the opposition Conservative Party, Mel Stride, making his response. We're waiting for some lines to come through from the DMO, waiting for lines to confirm how much the government's going to be borrowing. But a bit more maybe in that statement than anticipated, but certainly a tough line on her fiscal rules, saying they're non-negotiable, never take risks with the public finances, going on to say her fiscal rules will be met a couple of years early in one case and the other one being met early according to the latest figures, then talking about where the money's going to come from then to meet the fiscal rules around tax avoidance, welfare and the rest. We are just getting those lines coming through then from the DMO. The UK planning £299 billion in gilt sales in 2025-26. The estimate was £302 billion, so that number just a shade smaller than had been anticipated, and it does seem as if that has moved the gilt curve, because we had seen some of those yields on the rise while she was speaking, but after she sat down, we now see some of those yields are a little bit lower. Let us just have a bit, throw around some of the details of what we've heard there as we bring you those gilt movements, and we watch the opposition Mel Stride giving his statement. Where should we start then, Stephanie Flanders? There was a bit more in there than perhaps expected, but she was pretty tough in her fiscal rules, and she talked about all the things that had been anticipated about where she was going to find the money, really. Yeah. Anything standing out to you then? I
mean, I thought it was interesting. She started off, and I actually thought, wow, this is, she's going to really stick to the idea that this is going to be very focused on the fiscal rules. She's going to make as little of it as possible. And in fact, certainly in the second half, I think she decided, you know what, this is going to be a bigger statement. I might as well go for it.
And yields were climbing at that point.
But I think we had the bad news we'd expected, but a lot of it was slightly better. So I guess it suggests that the trailing was quite effective in setting expectations low. And I think there were some interesting aspects. OK, so we had the growth downgrade we expected. They've halved the growth forecast for this year. But some of that is expected to come back. I'm just looking at the numbers now. There's no change to next year's forecast on GDP, but after that, there's sort of a 0.2 increase. So most of, actually what we thought, more than half of the sort of reduction in the last year, they think is going to come back. We had not had trailed that increased extra $2 billion in investment. There's a bit more headroom on that other fiscal rule that the debt must be falling in the out years, and they've taken advantage of some of that. It's not big money, but you know, every little helps. I think if you're sitting on the other side, though, I think you would say there's a pivot that's happened that's really been completed by that speech. To think a year ago that a Labour government would be confirming $5 billion or a net $3.4 billion in cuts from the welfare budget, partly from squeezing benefits of people who are disabled or at least are unable to work, and then complementing that with a new defence growth strategy. You know, we can't sort of wish our way to recovery, but maybe we can arm our way to faster growth. I mean, I think a lot of people on the Conservative side would be saying, blimey, we would never have been able to get away with that. And it's kind of a moment.
Yes, and if you had $2 billion spare, as you say, not trailed, if the instinct is to put it into capital investment, that is an interesting development, as you say, an evolution in the Labour Party. John, then, other things that we heard about there, we got the figures on growth, as Stephanie said, 1% in 2025. That got a big response from the benches, didn't it? But then she saved the news till later that from 2026, that growth figure going higher. What was standing out to you?
I mean, I think what's standing out to me is the tax evasion element. I'll be curious to see how that works, because tax evasion has been a consistent sort of magic wand alert moment for savings. It was the same with the Conservative government. Anytime you wanted to find a bit of money back down the sofa, you would start talking about tax evasion. So I'll be interested to see whether that pans out and how it pans out. I think the other thing I would say is that obviously she's restored the fiscal headroom, and of course one of the main problems with our last budget was that fiscal headroom's not very big.
Yes.
You know, it's like 10 billion against a budget that is literally in the trillions. So I think the problem of the potential hostage to fortune, which doesn't matter at the moment, because as long as she's kept the gilts market happy, that's fine. But the issue is she might have to come back in autumn. And when she does come back in autumn, the risk then is that any shortfall comes from tax hikes rather than more spending cuts. But I mean, overall, I think she told the story she was expected to tell.
Yes.
And from a confidence point of view, that's probably a good thing.
Yes, I spoke to Lawrence Mutkin at BMO earlier, and he was saying, you know, this could be a bit of a holding statement, and maybe the reaction in gilt markets gives that impression, at least, even if there is a bit more detail in here, because we're kind of back where we started on gilt markets in terms of the response. Let's get some other input into our conversation. Stay with us, John and Stephanie. Lizzie Burton outside the House of Parliament, taking the temperature there. Lizzie, what stood out to you?
And I think the world might have changed. That's what she seemed to be emphasising in this speech. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, framing this spring statement or emergency budget, whatever you want to call it, as a necessary response to all these global headwinds, which she strongly hinted, didn't she, emanate from the White House. And that is why she says there is lower growth, as we see, at least in the short term, in the OBR's forecast, though, of course, it's been upgraded by 2029. And that is why there's less tax revenue, and hence why she needs to be making this £4.8 billion cut to welfare spending. It's also because of these global headwinds that there is more of a need for Europe to spend more on its own defence, and we heard there from Reeves saying that she wants to make the UK a defence industrial superpower. But look, I agree with John and Stephanie. What's really interesting here is that she's left the headroom at exactly the same amount as she did after the October budget, £9.9 billion. And we know that already got wiped out by now. So she's really leaving herself hostage to fortune here if yields rise again by the autumn. We know just next month, in April, we've got Trump's Tariff Day, Liberation Day, not many days away from when that payroll tax from the October budget comes into force. Yes, yields rose and then fell during when she spoke, but perhaps this spring statement today is just a prelude to the pain to come.
Well, we'll see. Lizzie, thank you very much. Lizzie Burden outside Westminster. No doubt you're getting missives from near and far and opinions on what we just heard there. Yes, there was a lot of emphasis, wasn't there, on the international context, and that is, as we discussed before we went into this, that is something that legitimately you can cite. But to your point about the headroom, it would be a brave person who would say that the world will be a stabler place from here, because even if April 2nd is looming and we know what we're going to... we have a sense of at least expecting something on April 2nd, that's not going to be the end of the story. Further disruption could lie ahead.
I mean, yeah, at the end of the day, it is, I think uncertainty is now the big watchword in markets, and that sounds kind of daft because obviously the future's always uncertain. But I think it is reasonable to say that the amount of volatility and the amount of surprises that can happen has gone up. Now, on the other hand, maybe yields will fall. Maybe long-term interest rates, because we're beyond the inflationary period, arguably. Things could settle down, and if the tariffs at the end of the day are not really likely to hit Britain as hard as the rest of our, trading partners, then maybe she'll get lucky. It just seems a little bit of a punt to say, right, we're just going to stick with what we've got.
Yes.
Mainly for political reasons again.
And Stephanie, thinking about that global context then, so maybe tariffs might not necessarily hit the UK, but if we are feeling things from the global environment, is it going to be those higher rates? You're in the sort of inflation's not going down to post-GFC levels camp, aren't you? So does that
certainly not interest rates, yeah.
Yeah. So does that suggest that we get, well, should we think that maybe rates go down from here, or we think that actually they remain pretty elevated?
I guess the step change is that we're not in an era of the kind of 1 or 2% bond yields. We have moved to a different kind of environment, even if we do see, I'm sure we will see short-term rates falling a bit more this year. I do think, I guess the slightly more positive, the world is very uncertain, but the US has also become a slightly more kind of mixed bag for investors thinking about, not just, for a long time it looked like a quite kind of a very rich market, shall we say. It's outperformed everything for this long, and it's been where all the growth is. It could be that will continue, despite the uncertainty being unleashed by the Trump administration. But I think there's at least some voices that will say, this is becoming a place where, the things that people care about when it comes to sort of rule of law, kind of stability, all of those things, are somewhat in question in the US in a way that they haven't been in recent years. And do we then look at, do people then start to look at the UK a bit more favourably, especially if it's slightly less caught up in the tariffs and other things that the EU is facing? I just think we could be at a point where there start to be some positives on the defence budget as well. If you have our defence industry is relatively strong relative to other parts of Europe. Big if, the government get its act together with a defence pact with the Europeans and is able to be part of that expansion of the European budget, we could stand to benefit from that. So, there are positives. It's not mad, the story she's telling. It is a narrow path.
It's a narrow path, in reference to the headroom then, perhaps, that you were talking about there. What else then stands out to us in looking back at what we've heard then from Rachel Reeves? So the yield story does seem to have settled down, interestingly. We did see that spike up. What made the markets nervous, do you think, there, John? What do you think made the markets nervous as we were listening to her? Because it seemed to be around the time that she disappointed on the growth front, but I'm not sure there's a direct read across.
I'm not sure. I think it might have just been down to them sitting there thinking, well, this sounds like she's talking about a lot of potential savings that might not come through. Perhaps there's some political risk. And obviously you are talking about a very small amount there. But the reason it came back down is because the DMO came out and said the gilts issue is going to be slightly lower than expected, and at the bottom end, obviously. I think that's what's driven that. So probably everyone's going back to their... their
and
assumptions.
We've gone past the peak, right? For net issuance, I think, is now... the peak was last year.
I think so.
Yeah, that's quite...
But also, the other thing, I do think that Stephanie's making, again, a very good point there. The US market's been very richly valued. We were kind of looking for some kind of catalyst for that to change and for capital to flow back out of the US and more towards markets in Europe, markets everywhere else in the world. And this just helps to confirm that, well, whatever else the UK is going to be doing is going to be spending money on defence and on building. And that's kind of catnip, especially for a cheap market,
yes,
as the UK kind of is.
We spoke to an investor yesterday from UBS. He was saying even if global investors just dialed down their exposure to the US 5%, that's $1 trillion out of US stocks. And that makes a big difference to where it ends up, to Europe, for example.
And I do think, how have we proved ourselves able to grow in the past? Not necessarily in a balanced way, but definitely through housing.
Yeah.
And it is interesting that the emphasis, it's quite a significant moment. We talked at the beginning, before Rachel Reeves spoke, we talked about how there were these long-term judgments that the OBR had not made, had not given them much credit for their long-term growth strategy. Well, there's this interesting, and I'm looking at the numbers here, she was able to brag that they have added to their growth forecasts in expectation of the planning reforms actually unlocking more investment. But what kind of investment is it unlocking? Well, it's all new residential investment. They believe that we will now get more significantly more residential investment in 2028, 2027, 2029, and that even though some of the extra money being spent by the government is crowding out private investment, they do think it's going to add to growth. And that's, we do know that that's one way that you can increase growth in this country, by building homes.
Reach for the manual that says how to increase
Have
growth.
us all continue to be obsessed with house prices.
Yes,
Exactly. I mean, that is good because at the end of the day, on the demand side, demand's been hit by rising interest rates. And, interest rates, I agree with Stephanie, we're not going to see 2% mortgage rates again. Maybe not even in our lifetimes. But the thing is, house prices are still ridiculously high. If they can actually break the physical supply issue, that would hopefully start to bring down house prices, and that would diffuse a lot of the political rage in this country.
Yes, and we started this talking about the mood that was created by the budget, and if you're looking for an alternative to that mood, well, anything that sounds like hope and sounds like future maybe goes down a little better, because that was something that whenever you start to talk about house prices, you're never far from an intergenerational conversation.
Your top fact. So they actually think that the planning reforms are going to produce another 170,000 houses by 2030.
OK, so there we are. And they certainly think that we heard Reeves saying that takes them within touching distance of the targets that they have for this Parliament. Thank you both very much. Thanks to John Sepek from Bloomberg Wealth. Thanks to Stephanie Flanders, also from who runs Bloomberg Economics and Government. Thank you very much to both of you for joining us for this special coverage of the UK Spring Statement. We have to hand you back now to our colleagues in the United States with Open Interest. They'll be up next, and this is Bloomberg.
One particular thing, so you can dismiss it. What's changed, I think, now is we see a much more sort of broader-based slowdown among all the soft and the survey data. I do fear that we've seen too much damage, and especially too much broad-based damage in the survey and the soft data in order to just dismiss it as a one-off.
That was one of Wall Street's newest bears, HSBC's Max Kettner, speaking to Bloomberg Surveillance after his double downgrade of U.S. equities. They were a buy, now a sell. This morning, Barclays is adding to the alarm, slashing its S&P 500 price target by 11%, down to 5,900 from 6,600 for the year end. The strategist at Barclays expecting tariffs to weigh on upcoming earnings and contribute to a material slowdown in U.S. activity.
Well, let's get another take on this. Joining us now is Moneta Chief Global Market Strategist Ethan Devitt. Ethan, great to see you. So we have more downgrades coming for the market, but JP Morgan and Morgan Stanley say that the worst is behind us and a rally can take form. Which side do you come down on?
That is a bit of a blow, a double downgrade. I have to agree. This is the time when we, in working with our clients, are really getting back to base principles. So we are going back